All right, welcome to the Big Brown Gadfly. This is a special edition. I have not been doing the Big Brown Gadfly, tied up with other things, but here I am with Jeff Dornick. How you doing, Jeff?
Very good. How you doing,
Okay,
Bobby?
great. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to let Jeff kind of introduce himself just for a couple seconds while I post this link up so people can join us, okay?
So,
So, shoot, Jeff, tell us about your role here at Gatekeepers, and what you are wanting to find out from me about the SBC election as this comes up.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I'm actually the founder of the Gatekeepers, and so we put this together. It just originally started out as just me and my podcast conversations with Jeff and just interviewing people and things like that. Slowly started adding on more shows, started posting articles, all that kind of stuff. Last year we put out, I think we published 3 books in the last year or so. So we
Yeah,
got so
there's gonna be more to come. It's gonna be more to come.
Yes. Soon more to come for sure. We got several in the works as well. So but yeah, so we've got like social injustice, we got 5 Steps to Kill a Nation, we got Church and State, all great books, all great topics, very important, very vital. And so we've been really trying to confront everything from things going on in the church to culture to politics, all from a biblical worldview. And I think
Right.
it kind of has created a unique group and a unique dynamic, I think, of we're not just focused on theology. We're not just focused on politics. It's kind of a little bit of everything, but it's always from
Mhm.
a biblical worldview, which is, I'm very appreciative of even you of just being a part of this, that you brought so much like wisdom and knowledge and everything to the team. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. It's definitely been a great experience working with you. I love it. I love that we're able to share a perspective that sometimes gets lost in everything because it's really easy for people to forget that, even on the side of people who define themselves as conservative, there's always a little bit of suppression, a little bit of corruption and stuff. So it's really great to have a haven for where we can criticize even some of the people who are on our side, which happens at Gatekeepers, which I'm happy about. Okay, so let's talk the SBC election. If you have been living under a rock and you don't know, the SBC is going to have its annual meeting this week. That's the Southern Baptist Convention. That's the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. We are electing a new president, and this is going to be a year that I believe will break the mold. It will not be like other annual meetings. There's a lot going on, and probably the biggest thing that is at stake is the election of the next president to replace J.D. Greer. And that election race is between these 4 gentlemen. All right. We have Ed Litton. Can you see him on the screen there, Jeff?
Yeah, we can see it.
All right. We have him. We have L. Mohler, president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. We've got Randy Adams, who is the former executive director of the Northwest Baptist Association, very heavily involved in missions. And we have Mike Stone, who is the former president or leader of the executive council. I don't know if that's a CEO position or a president, but of the executive committee of the SBC. So these are 4 pretty big name people. And I have prayed on this a lot, Jeff. You know that I've been heavily involved in the SBC, and I have come to who I'm going to endorse. All right. So, but first, let me try to lay it out for you. And I just would love to hear your perspective as an outsider. What are the things that you want to know about this election and to understand why an endorsement even matters?
Yeah, well, I think it's for me looking at it from the outside, because I'm not a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm not a part of the denomination, although I have a lot of friends that are, and so from that perspective, I've been following it. Especially, I mean, when you think about it, it's the largest denomination in the country. They hold a lot of sway even outside of the churches within the denomination. But for me, one of the things that I'm looking at is, it seems like obviously the leadership of the SBC has been progressively getting more progressive, more lefty, more woke, more social justice, all that kind of stuff. And I think for a lot of people, when they're looking at, okay, who's going to be the next president, I think for a lot of people it's very confusing, because everybody claims to be a conservative, right? Everybody claims to hold biblical values. Everybody says, oh yes, I believe in the inerrancy, I believe in this, I believe in that. But when push comes to shove, they're either woke or they're not. And it's harder and harder as time goes on, I think, for a lot of people to figure out who's woke and who's not without taking the time to actually listen to all their sermons, read their books, read their articles, all that kind of stuff. So for me, it's really trying to be able to decipher between the woke leadership versus the non-woke leadership. And is there even anybody who's not woke anymore? I have no idea.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me sort of lay this out for you. I am looking at it. Obviously, if people are woke, that's a huge concern for me. I don't want to elect anyone who's going to be pushing the progressive ideology about LGBT or anything unbiblical about intersectionality on the convention. That's obvious. But I'm actually very concerned also about corruption and about just ethical management. So what we have right now, let me lay these four candidates out for you. This is like a microcosm of American politics, where you've got a candidate who basically is just like the Democrats. You've got a rhino candidate who's the corrupt old GOP. And then you've got a MAGA incorporated candidate who is going to bring in a lot of the problems that we've seen with Donald Trump. I know that you've been publishing a lot on that with gatekeepers. I was a Trump supporter. I know you were a Trump supporter. But he came out and just endorsed Greg Abbott after Greg Abbott sank everything that was conservative in Texas. So there's reasons to say that someone's a MAGA candidate, and that's not always just a purely good thing. And then we have a fourth person who's like Mr. Smith goes to Washington, who is, basically an outsider who's going to look at it differently. So let me go over these one by one. First, we have Ed Litton, who is very much, he's a Democrat, essentially. I'm sure he would probably jump and say, no, that's not true. But he associates himself with a lot of the people who are heavily woke. He's close to Beth Moore. He was showcased at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is supported by people at SBC Voices, which is a left-leaning publication. So if you're going to go Ed Litton, that what you're going to be getting for the bargain is you're going to be getting a Joe Biden presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention. There's no doubt about that. Some people feel like that will be a good turn given the fact that the evangelical population was so thoroughly behind Donald Trump. Whatever, that's people's decision to make. But that there you have Ed Litton. Then you have Al Mohler, and Al Mohler is the rhino candidate. He's the person who made his name in the conservative resurgence, but that was 30 years ago. And now it seems as though mostly what he brings to the table is a lot of insider old boy network connections. He is single-handedly responsible for every direction that the SBC is taking right now, because the people who are leading every single entity from Lifeway to the mission boards to each of the seminaries are all proteges of Al Mohler, okay? And Al Mohler is definitely your classic old boy network machine operator. He's the kind of person who will make a phone call to make sure you never work in this town again if you cross him, and he has used that power by and large to take out his rivals and to take out people who are critical of his chosen successors. And as a result of that, what I've seen is largely he's attacking people who are conservative. He kind of punches right. Very typical. He's like the Lynn Cheney of this race, okay? And then you have Mike Stone, who I would say is kind of like the MAGA Incorporated candidate. He's close to the Charlie Kirk circle. I know that he's part of the Conservative Baptist Network, which is, from what I can tell, they seem to be tied to Liberty University. Their breakfast is going to be hosted by that institute that was started by Jerry Falwell Jr. and Charlie Kirk. He has close ties to people like Todd Starnes and Janet Mefford, these MAGA-style radio personalities, etc. So he's got a lot of momentum on that side from him. And then you have Randy Adams, who I would describe as the outsider candidate. He is the candidate who is like Mr. Smith comes to Washington. He's from Washington State, so he's from outside of the South. He really comes with an outsider perspective. And he has put front and center transparency and ethical leadership and financial responsibility and putting an end to non-disclosure agreements and a lot of those corrupt practices with blacklisting and retaliation, which I think the left has used very successfully to force their way into a lot of these institutions. So there you have the four of them. Did that make any sense to you, Jeff?
No, yeah, I think it makes perfect sense, and I think for people that are watching this, that and I know like your regular viewers and regular listeners will know what you're talking about when you talk about like the everything from like the non-disclosure agreements to and the corruption and things like that. But when you're talking about that for somebody who's watching that maybe they're not as familiar, they're not following this closely, what are you referring to, especially when it comes to the non-disclosure agreements?
All right, non-disclosure agreements were the documents that were used, for instance, by Harvey Weinstein, where if there was something very disturbing that happened, like sex abuse or embezzlement, uh, and people wanted to avoid a big public conflagration, they would have somebody sign a non-disclosure agreement. You would pay them off. You would give them, let's say, $100,000, and they would have to sign a legal agreement saying they will never discuss anything about this case with anyone's, often including with their friends, with their family members. They're not allowed to discuss it, or they're under penalty of some kind of legal damages, right? Some punitive damages. Now, non-disclosure agreements have no biblical basis whatsoever. I've written about this extensively. They do not belong in any kind of church setting, but unfortunately, the SBC is rampant. They are rampant in the SBC. The mission boards, for instance, have people sign these non-disclosure agreements before they get deals to plant churches. Very often, when professors are asked to leave seminaries, they're offered these non-disclosure agreements. Often, what happens is the seminary will say to someone, you can either get fired today, today's your last paycheck, goodbye, you're out in the cold, or we'll give you 3 to 6 months of pay, and then in exchange for that buffer, that cushion of financial support, you're going to have to sign this agreement saying you're never going to discuss any of these matters with anybody. So it's a huge problem. The left has benefited greatly from non-disclosure agreements because largely conservative people who have been driven out of their jobs have been pressured to sign non-disclosure agreements, really because a lot of the times those who are driving conservatives out of Southern Baptist institutions know that Southern Baptist people are by and large very conservative. So they're going to be very angry that conservatives are getting fired. So they get people to sign non-disclosure agreements so that people basically will never find out that this is what's really going on. Okay. That makes
Yeah, well,
sense?
and I'll jump in too because it's one of those things where for me I've been in both the business world as well as within the church and all that kind of stuff. I understand non-disclosure agreements when it comes to the business world because a lot of times there you're dealing with competition, you're dealing with strategy, you're dealing with somebody defecting and going to a competitor, and you don't want them to take your trade secrets and things like that. So for people that are watching, you're like, well, non-disclosure agreements are used in all different areas of life. I get it when it comes to the business world because a business like let's say you've got somebody who works for Apple, they're going to have specific strategies and specific software and knowledge and understanding that they don't want them to leave and then go and take it over to Microsoft. I get that kind of a thing. Within the church setting, however, I don't see any justification
Yeah,
for
there's
anybody to sign because we're not supposed to be in competition with each other. This is not a business. There's no such thing as trade secrets. If you're doing something wrong, then it should be dealt with biblically, according to Matthew 18 and all of that kind of stuff. There should be no place for this anywhere in the church. But the more I'm in this whole church world, it seems like this is standard procedure, it seems like, for the mega churches and a lot of the big denominations.
Well, and that's why we started at the beginning, and I was saying, yeah, I'm concerned about the wokeness, but I'm actually just more concerned about the fact that the SBC is functioning not just like a corporation, but like a cutthroat corporation, and a corporation that can't sell its own products. I mean, it's a bad product that they're offering to people because everything's going downhill. We lost the largest number of believers in this last year. Our baptisms are down, our giving is down. We lost close to 500,000 churchgoers left the Southern Baptist denomination last year. So we're in massive trouble. And of course, everybody's blaming everybody else. The left is blaming Donald Trump for driving people away. The right is blaming the woke people for stuffing critical race theory down people's throats. There's a lot of fingers being pointed, but I think at the core of it is the fact that we're being run like a corrupt corporation, and people don't want their church to function like that. So people
Yeah.
are leaving because they're disgusted by what they see. Okay, so
And Bobby, if I could just hop in one more thing about, especially about the non-disclosure agreements and a lot of the corruptions and stuff like that, right? And so because I think that there's probably a legitimate a legitimate case for a lot of the debates that are going on, like you're saying, between the more lefty evangelicals and the more conservative, or even the Trump crowd. I think there's a legitimate place where we need to be having that debate. We need to come to a consensus, but we can only come to a consensus if we actually duke it out. We debate the issues, and I think that's an important thing to have. But when you deal with this corruption and the non-disclosure agreements, it's very reminiscent to me of the Church of Scientology. And I followed that very closely because I know people that have come out of Scientology, and I watched the show that Leah Remini put together talking about that. And one of the ways that the Church of Scientology gets away with so much corruption, they cover up so much abuse and so much illegal activity, is through this use of non-disclosure agreements. Because if you become a member, you sign a non-disclosure agreement that you are not going to tell anybody outside of the church anything that's going on inside. How do you think they've gotten away with this for so many years? They even get into court cases, and then because the people have signed these non-disclosure agreements, they can't sue. They can't do anything. It's a way to hide up corruption. We see that with the Church of Scientology. And to me, what's scary is we're seeing it within the evangelical world, which makes me feel like, is there some reminiscence of cult mentality and cult behavior being blended together with biblical theology? That's dangerous territory for like abusive leadership and things along those lines.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I don't know if you can. Am I still on, or
Yeah. No, you're coming in.
you can still hear me? Okay. Right. Yeah. Because sometimes the stream is really bad in my neighborhood. Can you still hear me?
Yep, you're coming in good.
I think it's. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to point out about the non-disclosure agreements is the fact that Randy Adams has made this a major campaign issue, and he's the only one who has. From what I understand, Mike Stone has not come out against non-disclosure agreements, even though, there were reasons that I kind of was hoping that he would. So that's kind of a major thing that I want to point out. If we look at the corruption and the transparency issues, starting from get-go, this narrows down my choices very quickly. Okay, L. Mohler is absolutely a no-go from my mind, from a perspective of corruption and improper management of things. I don't know if you can still hear me or if I'm frozen.
No,
Can you hear me?
No, yeah, you're coming in great. You're coming in great.
Okay, all right. So I think that L. Mohler, for me, he's a no-go. He has been the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary for 27 years, and it's clear that I don't think that he really ever plans to roll back into this corruption because it benefits him. So he's somebody who I think probably. He's just so entrenched, and he has so many ties to people everywhere, and he's been using these non-disclosure agreements so liberally. He's been so accustomed to making a phone call and ending people's careers that it's almost like, I can't really picture him changing much of anything. And so he's kind of, in my mind, he's a non-starter. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Okay, so he's a non-starter. That leaves us with Litton, Stone, and Adams. Litton, from what I can tell, is just way too tied up with Beth Moore and all of this celebrity woke culture, and I just think he will go in a direction that is the opposite direction from what we wanted. So this then leaves me with the very difficult choice between Stone and Adams, because both of those are the two sort of more authentically conservative choices. And between the two of them, I think the main thing that I wanted to look at was what will actually change in terms of the things that I saw that were a problem when I was in the Southern Baptist Convention. What can I really reasonably anticipate will change if one of these two people gets elected? You know that I have had a very difficult journey with the Southern Baptist Convention, and I'm not just thinking about my experience. I'm thinking of all the experience who have been, all the people who've been treated very disrespectfully, all the people who have been driven out of their jobs because they're defending the gospel, because they're exposing sex abuse, or they're exposing bad theology, or they're exposing the critical race theory in it. And I know what it's like to be targeted, and to have a phone call placed, and to have your speaking engagements canceled. And I know what it's like to have to sit there in the pews and to see bad fake theology being forced down people's throats, and to see the people in power not do anything about it, right? Okay, so I have to be totally frank. I like Mike Stone a lot. I like a lot of what he says. I think that he brings up a lot of great things. I thought it was very brave of him to come forward as a survivor of sex abuse. I think a lot of the attacks on him were unfair. All right. But when he was the president of the executive committee, nobody in his circle did anything. I reached out for help, and they didn't want to help me. And he's tied to Janet Mefford, who I had a terrible experience with. I think that she lacked basic ethics. I think she's a poison on our side. Many people think that she's a great radio host, and I saw the way that she works behind the scenes. She turns on people, and she will destroy someone's career with absolutely no regard to them as a person. And he seems to be closely tied to her. He seems to be very closely tied to the Charlie Kirk circle surrounding the Falwell Institute. And I don't think that those people will come out of the woodwork to change very much of anything, because they're so comfortable in their funding. So while I think that Mike Stone is a good candidate, and he's a conservative, solid candidate, I'm concerned with a lot of the people he's friends with. I have the same concerns about him that I would have over any MAGA candidate now, given the direction that Donald Trump has taken. And I don't think that it'll be that substantially different for me or for other people, if he gets in power. So I'm going to go with Randy Adams. I think Randy Adams is the person that I think, if he were to actually get elected, it would be such a massive shift that I think that we could actually see some changes. And he's talking about making bold moves, like calling for massive financial disclosures from the pulpit, and calling for people who have been engaged in retaliation and nepotism, to be investigated and to be removed. So that is my endorsements. All right. I'm going
Sounds good.
for Randy Adams. What do you think of my logic here?
I think it makes perfect sense, and I think as well, when we're dealing with a lot of this kind of stuff within church leadership, I think what ends up happening is a lot of people, they look strictly at the theological positions of a lot of these guys, which I think is very, very important, obviously, but I think oftentimes we turn a blind eye to the areas outside of theology. Again, getting into corruption, getting into a good old boys club, getting into non-disclosures, getting into financial issues and things like that. And I think that those are just as important, if not in certain circumstances, even more important than strict theological purity. Because there's room for certain areas where we can disagree, and that's perfectly fine. But I would rather have an ethical person who's maybe off on certain theological things, obviously not compromising the gospel or anything along those lines. And I'm not saying anything about Randy Adams because I don't know anything about his theology. But the fact that he's taking such a strong stand, it seems like, on making changes to the corruption angle within the SBC, I think is going to be vitally, vitally important.
Yeah. All right. That's my endorsement. I think that for people who share our basic worldview and concerns, I think it really has to boil down to Mike Stone or Randy Adams. And it is a tough choice, because I think they're both really good candidates. And I had to pray on it a long time. One of the things I did like about Randy Adams is he was accessible. I was able to speak with him and get responses to a lot of the things that I wanted to know more about. One of the things that I hope that Randy Adams can do this week is I hope that he can broaden his perspective on what needs to be reformed, and talk more about the seminaries and Lifeway and some of the other entities, because a lot of his focus has been on missions and on the state conventions, which is important because there's a lot of money there, but there's also a lot of money in the seminaries. And I think the seminaries are a beast of their own. And that was one reason why it was a little bit hard for me to choose between Adams and Stone, because I think that Mike Stone has spoken a little bit more to what kind of things that worry me about the seminaries. But I think that we don't want to replace one old boys network with another old boys network. And I think that is probably my biggest worry with Mike Stone and I just don't, when he was leading the executive, council or the executive committee, I didn't get the sense that like any people would do anything about the things that were happening to me or to other people in my situation. But I do think that Randy Adams, he is looking at those things and he does want to end non-disclosure agreements on those things. So that gets my endorsement. I have nothing against anyone who chooses differently than I do, but that's what I'm doing going into the SBC. All right. Thank you so much for joining me, Jeff.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.